My clinical experience, I would say, and my life experience taught me that you could divide your life in some sense into thirds. And 1/3 of that is intimate relationship, so we'll say marriage. 1/3 of that is family, and 1/3 of that is career. That's a rough break, a rough categorization, but it's not a bad place to start with regards to rule of thumb. Well, why get married? Well, people want a partner. Half the dialogue that you hear between people, especially if they're single, is related to their desire to have a partner. And of course, half the dialogue you hear from people who are in a relationship is how to deal with problems in their relationship. But it's a very rare person who doesn't need and want an intimate relationship. And then you have to ask yourself, well, what does intimate mean? And the cheap interpretation of intimate is sexual, but that's a pale reflection in some sense of true intimacy, even on the sexual front, because true intimacy means getting to know someone. It's interesting that the biblical term for sexual congress is knowledge. And I think that's because the intimacy that brings about the highest level of sexual fulfillment, all things considered, has to be nested within a much more profound and properly integrated and oriented intimacy. And I think that most fundamentally that's to be found in the state of marriage. People often think about marriage as the death of sex, let's say, but permanent singlehood is also, by the way, the death of sex. And one of the things that we've seen as the sexual revolution has continued apace is that young people are, in some sense, more disturbed in their sexual orientation rather than less, turning to pornography and masturbation, and forswearing intimate relationships entirely, or forswearing sexual interaction of all sorts, even self-administered entirely. And that doesn't seem to be a plus. So you enter into marriage as an act of faith. You fall in love with someone, which is a grace, a gift of God in some real sense. You see what it would be like to care for someone. You see what it would be like to have someone care for you and value you. You get a glimpse of that in love. And then you have a challenge set before you, which is, can you arrange your life with this person that you've fallen in love with so that that state of love permeates the entire relationship and everything you do together all the time? And so that would make a marriage the perfect date that repeats endlessly. Now, obviously, that's an extraordinarily high goal to hit, a high mountain to climb, but you need something to do, and it might as well be that. And in an intimate relationship, when things are going as well as they can go, I think you're hard-pressed to find anything better in life. So why not attempt to achieve that? Well, why do you need marriage? Well, you need marriage just like you need other social institutions. Marriage is a great burden and responsibility, as well as a great opportunity. It's a burden and responsibility because as a married couple, you're going to face together everything that life can throw at you. And so the difference between a casual affair, let's say, and a marriage is that the casual affair is all milk and honey, let's say. It's all pleasure, although it very rarely works out that way, but that's the theory. Whereas in the marriage, you have to contend with the harsh realities of all the dimensions of life. But you want to take that on voluntarily, and you want to share that with someone. And if you do that properly within the confines of a marriage, then you have someone to weave together the rope of the narrative of your life. And you have someone to bounce yourself off, and you have someone to improve yourself in relationship with, and you have someone that you have to take into consideration, like you should take yourself into consideration, and you have someone that you have to take into consideration over the longest possible span of time. And what that means is that you're forced, in a real sense, to perform the kind of sacrifice of impulsive hedonism that produces a true maturity. So let's say, imagine that you're only out for yourself, and maybe you are willing to use other people instrumentally sexually, and your motivation is hedonism and pleasure come what may. It's like, okay, let's think about that. Well, what do you mean by pleasure? Do you mean pleasure in the next 30 seconds? Do you mean pleasure in the next 3 minutes? Do you mean pleasure tonight? And I'm asking because you might say, well, why not cocaine and hookers as a non-stop diet? And the answer to that seems to be something like, well, it might be good for 3 minutes or one evening, but the hangover the next day isn't to be desired, and that gets worse the more you walk down that hedonic route. And then there's the call of conscience that comes a knocking at 3 a.m. when you're hungover and dissolute after your idiot promiscuous rampage. It's a bad medium to long-term strategy. So when we're talking about hedonism, we have to specify exactly what we mean. Are you doing what makes you happy in an impulsive way? Or are you doing what's best for you in the multiplicity of your iterations across the broadest span of decades? And then we would say, well, if you're acting properly in relationship to you and all of your future selves, then you're sacrificing the idiot impulsive hedonism of the present to a medium to long-term strategy that's preferable in all regards. And I would say that's part of developing an adult vision. And then you might say, well, I want to be free to pursue my hedonic demands, desires, whenever I want to, under what conditions, whatever conditions prevail. And I would first say, well, do you really think that's possible? Like, how is that going to work? Second, aren't you just going to use other people for your own pleasure? Third, aren't you just going to use yourself for your own short-term and counterproductive pleasure? Fourth, how is that different from being a 2-year-old? There's nothing in that that's a mature vision. And so you could imagine, and this is a technical argument, that the nature of moral behavior is constrained by the fact of your repetition across the hours and days and weeks and months and years of your life. You have to act in relationship to yourself like you're a totality stretched across time. And so that means that, and this is why conscience bothers you if you betray yourself, is because your conscience is an indicator of behavior in relationship to the medium and the long run. Now, that means you have to treat yourself like you're a community that extends across time. And one way of learning how to do that, that's very profound, is to shackle yourself to another person, say within the confines of a marriage, because then you know that, well, you're going to be with that person for the minutes and hours and days and weeks and years of your life. And so you have to treat them in a manner that's reciprocal and productive, that grows positively over decades. And then you can imagine that there's a complex optimization problem that emerges out of that, which is, well, how do you treat someone in your moment-to-moment interactions so that the relationship blossoms into, well, let's say, continual love? And that's a good thing to aim at. And there's no difference between doing that and treating yourself properly. They're the same thing. And then you can imagine if you treated yourself properly and your partner properly, and you really learned how to do that. This is a deep problem. It's a deep problem, and you have to be challenged to do it constantly. If you did that properly, first of all, there'd be nothing better that could possibly happen to you. And second, you'd have the perfect platform for having children. Because now the children come into the world, and there's 2 of you, and you're side by side, and you're treating each other like you're extensions of each other, which you are, because you're stuck with this person forever. And then the child has the amalgam, the joint amalgam of 2 personalities that have had to bargain and negotiate to produce a unity. And the child's introduced into the fact of that unity, which is the higher order structure that governs the marriage. So that's Christ himself in the Christian marriage tradition, let's say. Or you could think of it as the law and the prophets in the Jewish tradition. It boils down in some sense to the same thing. Now the child enters a world where a negotiated solution between 2 mature partners has been established, and his or her behavior can be calibrated in relationship to that joint union. And that union is wiser than either of the two individuals would have been on their own. Wiser because the medium to long-term reality of mature life has been factored into account, but also wiser because the voluntary and forced union of the two personalities in the marriage produces a meta-personality that's a much better representation of the ideal mature adult toward which the child should orient his or her developmental strivings. And so now with a child, you're looking at a relationship that's going to last, in all likelihood, the entire course of your life. Certainly as a dependent for at least 18 years and probably longer than that. And so the necessity of getting this right in the medium to long term is self-evident. You might ask yourself, well, why have children? Well, let's look at the objections first. The planet has too many people on it. It's like, no, we're not accepting that argument. First of all, as population has increased over the last 40 years dramatically, people have got much, much richer. Not just a little bit, but a lot. And so what that indicates absolutely clearly is that more people produce more wealth, not less. And then you might say, well, wealth destroys the planet. And I would say, you think wealth destroys the planet? Try and force poverty to see what destroys the planet. And all the data that I've been able to accumulate indicates that the fastest way forward to a sustainable future is to ameliorate absolute poverty at the lowest level of the hierarchy of economic security and opportunity. Period. And then the economists have been fighting with the biologists, the Malthusian biologists, for 50 years about whether human ingenuity can remove us from a landscape of privation and want and Malthusian population explosion disaster. And the economists have won the argument every single time it was clearly formulated and clearly put forth as a proposition by the Malthusian biologists. Because it seems to be the case that the human imagination, untrammeled and oriented properly, can continually make more out of less. And if you don't believe that, then just think a little bit about computational capacity and the fact that every year and a half, our computational capacity doubles with the utilization of less and less resources. So the notion that we're born into a landscape of inevitable scarcity, wrong. And it's not just wrong, it's deeply anti-human, and sometimes it's so deeply anti-human that it borders on the demonic and genocidal. And you might say that's an overstatement. Goethe, Faust, Mephistopheles, the figure of Lucifer or Satan. What's Mephistopheles' credo in Faust? Life is so bitter and so full of betrayal and malevolence that it would be better if nothing existed at all. That's the Mephistophelian creed. And that's a very deep argument, and there isn't any argument that's more wrong. So in the opening scenes of Genesis, when God creates the world, when order extracts the world out of chaos, God states repeatedly, and it was good. And so the idea is that the reality that emerges out of the truthful and loving confrontation with chaotic possibility is good if it's incarnated properly. And that's part of the challenge in a marriage, is how to set the marriage up so that the joint personality, which is an analog of Christ or the Word in the Christian tradition, faces the potential of the future and structures it so that it's good. And then you bring children into that, and that's good too. Okay, then you might say, well, what about the responsibility of children? It's like, well, first of all, what do you want? You don't want responsibility? What do you want instead? You want nothing? You want nihilism? You want cynicism? You want immaturity? You want dependence? You want this narrow hedonism that sacrifices even yourself to the demands of the moment? We could say something else about that too. You might say, well, I want to be free to pursue what I want to pursue. It's like, what you want to pursue, eh? Who's the you we're talking about here? So you're satisfying your lust, you're satisfying your gluttony, you're satisfying your envy, you're satisfying your rage, you're satisfying your sense of victimization. What makes you think that those aren't gods that are ruling you? You think that's you and your freedom? To be as impulsive hedonically as you want? Why aren't you just in the grip of a lesser devil? Because that's exactly what it looks like to me, and it certainly plays out that way in people's lives. That short-term impulsive hedonism, which is the lack of the sacrificial mentality, that produces nothing but chaotic disaster, anxiety, misery, a decrement in happiness overall. Certainly no noble pursuit, no adventure, nothing but a pathetic, cringing, oldest frat boy at the party nihilism by the age of 40. There is nothing good about that. And so you take on the responsibility of a marriage. Voluntarily, as an adventure, you take on the responsibility of children. It's good to bring children into the world. It's proper to bring them into a well-constituted marriage. And then you might say, well, what's on the upside? Is it all burden and responsibility? And the answer to that is, well, you have people around you that you love, hypothetically, your family members, and you're pretty happy that you have a family, so you're not completely alone. And I know sometimes people have miserable, disjointed, horrible families, but usually even in those situations when a mother or father dies, the children grieve. So there's even value to be found there. It's like you got a family. It's like, you could expand that family. You could have kids, and then all of a sudden you'd have more people who are just as important to you as the most important people in your life has ever been. Now, why is that a problem? And then there's more. That child wants more than anything else to have the best possible relationship with you that anyone ever had with anyone. That's what they want. And you could have that with the child if you got your act together. And so then you could be surrounded by people who have the best relationship with you that there could possibly be. And that could last for the rest of your life. It's like, where's the problem here? And then you think, well, kids, they interfere with what do they interfere with exactly? Like cocaine-fueled binge parties? Yeah, they interfere with that. And maybe that's good because then you won't die stupidly face down in a ditch. And I can say that with some authority because I had clients who died exactly that way. And I wouldn't recommend it, precisely. And so, and children, they reward you like mad, as long as you put down a minimum of rules and you have some order in the household and some predictability so that they don't get hot or cold or wet or tired or hungry. That's about the whole limit of child catastrophe. So if you can get that under control, you've pretty much got it. They're so much fun to be around that why would you do anything else? As a woman, well, you have the opportunity for a lot of cuddling and intimate love. And women, good mothers, are really good at that, especially with infants. They're very good at seeing the nascent person and establishing a relationship very early on. But once the child's old enough to engage in a little bit of play, rough and tumble play, which is more on the male side, then that's just a continual blast. And I mean, part of what you end up doing with kids, which is kind of sad, is they're so much fun that half the time what you do is discipline them because they're having too much fun. Because they're noisy and boisterous and running around the place. And that can just get to be too much. You have to put a limit on that impulsive play as well. And then kids play all the time. If you can establish the conditions for that, which is an indication that you have your household set up right, because then the children will play. And there isn't any higher form of activity than play. And so if your household is set up properly, then you can all play. And that's the best thing you can possibly do. So I just don't see that as a particular problem too. And then you might think, well, I have to establish a secure basis for them and I have to be a reliable provider. And it's like, yeah, okay, you got something better to do? And you're going to have a career or a job and you need to be maximally motivated to do that properly because otherwise you're going to be a scoundrel at half-wit and you're going to laze around and be useless. And some of that's got to come from demand. Some of it should be, well, I want to be a good plumber, or I want to be a good electrician. There's some hope in it. But some of it should also be, hey, I got people depending on me, and I better grow up and do a good job because otherwise there's going to be some unnecessary suffering of the innocents. And so what? You have kids now, you have to grow up and somehow know now you're not Peter Pan, and that's supposed to be a problem? I don't see that as a problem. I see that as an opportunity. And then you might say, well, you marry the same old person. It's like, if you're bored by someone, okay, that's you. That's you. You're caught in the prisons of your own presumptions and you're overlaying something on people and it's some it's some dead and sterile apprehension you have about the nature of humanity, and you're just running into that over and over. And you think, oh, people are so boring. It's like, nope, that's you. If it's people, it's you. It's just like, if women are a problem and you're a man, that's you. If men are a problem and you're a woman, that's you. And if you're bored by people, that's you. And so now you're bored by your partner. It's like, are you bored by your partner, or what are you bored by what you forced them to become? Or are you bored by your lack of creative imagination on the erotic and intimate front? Are you bored by the fact that you've turned your house into a sterile, fear-ridden prison? It's like, just who's boring here? And then the next issue is, well, what makes you think that someone isn't an infinite mystery? It's like, you are. Have you tried getting yourself under control? That's real difficult. You're full of snakes and surprises. You don't think your partner's exactly the same way? And of course, there's a downside to that, because you run into weird impediments as you move forward together. But there's this infinite wellspring of mystery. And I would say, when you fall in love with someone, which is generally the precondition for marriage, when you fall in love with someone, you see that infinite wellspring of mystery. It's granted to you as a gift, and then if you have any sense and you're willing to devote yourself to it in no small manner, then you can foster that infinite wellspring to continually pour forth, and you'll find that that one person you're with is way more interesting than any plethora of short-term shallow relationships that you could possibly imagine. And I do not believe that there are people who don't know that. We all know that. We know it. And we might come up with a very large number of rationalizations for why we don't need to take responsibility, and why short-term, hedonic, pleasure-centered one-night stands are just the thing, but I don't see any of that credible in the least. And I would also like to point out on the promiscuity front that that also presents a non-trivial and constant public health danger. And we just about took ourselves out with AIDS, and everybody shorted out about that for about 15 years. And it doesn't look to me like we've got any smarter in the interim. Now, and then you might say, well, who needs marriage? It's just a piece of paper. We'll just live together and our love can carry us through. It's like, really, you're so good at loving, are you? You're that good that that'll just carry you through. You don't need to stand up in front of your whole community and bind yourself in commitment and to the other person, and to make that public, and to make it formal, and to ally yourselves with the monogamous traditions of the past. You're above all that, are you? It's just a piece of paper. That's your argument. And so, no, because to be bound together in marriage is a very difficult thing. There are many forces that will pull you apart, and your family and your friends and your community need to know that you're dead serious about this, and you need to know that they're on board for the game. The in-laws and the extended friendship networks of both couples have to be brought into this as part of the broader community that supports the married couple. And so if you can't sacralize that with one-day ceremony, then you have to ask yourself, just how committed are you to this other person or to yourself? It's so shallow. And men do this to women a lot, because my experience has been women are generally, if they're living with someone, are much more unhappy about the fact that it's merely, or more overtly unhappy, that it's merely a short-term arrangement. And then we could go into that. Well, you should try someone out before you live with them. Really, like a used car, that's what you should do. You take them for a test drive and see if you're compatible. And you could say, well, yeah, that's the sensible thing to do. It's like, okay, let's look at the data. Do couples who live together before they're married get divorced more or less than couples who just get married? And the answer is, they get divorced more. And so, it doesn't work. Why? Well, let's delve into the philosophy of living together. It's like, okay, we've been going out for a while and we're not fighting too much, and we kind of think we might be all right. Or maybe we think this, you're the bloody best I can do for now. And so I'm kind of lonesome, and some sex now and then wouldn't be a bad idea. So why don't we just live together and see how that goes? But if someone better comes along on either of our fronts, then why don't we reserve to ourselves the opportunity just to say, well, we're done with this because someone better has come along. It's like, that's the basis for your medium to long-term arrangement, is it? And you tell me you think it's different than that? It's a trial run. That doesn't work. It's what? It's an open door? Well, how committed are you going to be then? And you're not going to have an eye out for a better option continually, and you haven't given yourself permission for that. And you think, as a man, you think a woman's going to open up to you on the intimacy front, sexually, let's say, when there's ambivalence about the contractual permanence of the relationship? If you think that, you are naive beyond belief. And you can also be sure that your sex life is suffering in ways you can barely understand because of that. So I don't buy the whole serial monogamy or the live together notion. That just seems to be a non-starter to me. That's also partly because marriage is one of those all-in games. And so it's an act of faith. Why is it an act of faith? Well, you don't know if you can get along with this person. You're in love with them. You find them attractive. And I think those are two important preconditions. But you're both ignorant and young. You have no idea who you are, who you're going to be. How do you know that you can be married? And the answer is you don't know. You decide. You decide. That's the act of faith. It's like, I am going to act this out. And then even more, it's like, I'm going to act this out come hell or high water. And why? Well, because hell and high water are coming, because you're alive and you're married and you're going to be together for decades. And so you are definitely going to go through the worst times of your life with this person. And then you might say, well, do you want to go through the worst times of your life alone? And are you better situated to survive the worst times of your life if you're with someone that you love? Is that a good joint arc to construct when the storms are coming? And it seems like the answer to that's pretty much yes, especially if you add to that children and the, let's say, robust improvement of the surrounding family. How is that not positive? And so that's a step of faith. It's like, I'm imperfect, God, that's for sure, and so are you, and we're fortunate we found anyone at all, and we have a short lifespan and can't sort through all 3.5 billion potentially available partners, and so at some point we're going to have to say, all things considered, this is a good enough starting point, and then we're going to commit to this in some fundamental manner. And then I would say, the more fundamentally you commit to it, and this is the issue of the vow, the more serious you take the marriage. Because you know, I'm trapped. Man, I'm stuck with you. Just like I'm stuck with myself. There is absolutely no escape from you. And so we can either enslave each other, or we can tyrannize over each other, or we can negotiate our way to a genuine and loving peace. Those are the options. And I don't think that you will do the difficult work necessary to negotiate to a stable and loving peace without a gun to your head. And you might say, well, I will. It's like, yeah, you're a saint, are you? You're an Old Testament prophet. You're the sort of person that just has it 100% together, are you? And you're going to be able to negotiate with someone different than you of the opposite sex successfully by yourself with no social scaffolding. That's your theory. Or that none of that's necessary. Well, those are not good theories, and they're not going to work out well for you when you play them out in your life. My friend, a friend of mine who's Swedish, married a woman of Swedish descent, and they decided to go to Sweden to get married. And during the marriage ceremony, one thing they were asked to do was hold a candle aloft between them jointly. And the candle signified Christ, like the star on a Christmas tree signifies Christ, or the sun re-arising at the lowest point of the winter signifies Christ, or the lights on a Christmas tree in general signify the light in the darkness and the light on the hill, all of that. And so what's the symbolic meaning, the metaphoric meaning of that holding the candle aloft? And the answer is, well, imagine that in our marriage, which could be the deepest form of relationship, there's a real dialogue that's established. And dia is duo, is two, and log is logos. Logos, and logos is the rationality of the implicit order of the world, and also the figure of Christ, technically speaking. And so a dialogue is the attempt to embody the implicit logic of being and the spirit of Christ in a communicative relationship. And that is its own spirit. So you might say, well, when are you inhabiting the spirit of the logos? Or when are you allowing it to inhabit you? And the answer is, well, let's say you're having a conversation with someone. It's a really good conversation. You're deeply engrossed in it. It's really meaningful. It's really deep. The time flies by. You don't notice the clock. You learn a lot. You're completely open, so you're letting your presuppositions be altered at the optimal rate, which feels extraordinarily meaningful. And both of you are doing that, so both of you are acting out the same pattern, and that is the pattern of the word, and that's the pattern that both people in the marriage are supposed to be subordinate to. And so that's a spirit of negotiation. Now, here's another way of thinking about it. We could think about this on the sexual front, if we might as well get right to brass tacks. It's like, well, you want to have a joyful and compelling and insanely engrossing sex life. And you might think, well, that's to be found in diversity of partners. Like, yeah, I don't think so. That isn't how the data lays itself out, let's say. What you get there is an endless string of shallow, short-term interactions which have the thrill of novelty, but nothing else going for them. So no. On the marital front, well, so then you have the opportunity to think, well, I could have the best intimate life I could possibly imagine. So imagine that's a possibility. You could have the best intimate life you could possibly imagine. Okay, so the first thing is, you have to imagine it. Now, people do this. So most people have erotic fantasies, and they spontaneously manifest themselves. And the more suppressed those are, by the way, the more extreme they become. So that's something to know. So you have an erotic fantasy, just like you might have a fantasy about making something to eat when you get hungry. You know, it's this biological system that's very deeply embedded within you, has some notions about how it might be gratified properly, and it sends up these little dreams that manifest themselves to you as fantasies. And those fantasies are, assuming they haven't been suppressed too badly and warped because of that, because you've been lying to yourself, those fantasies tell you what you want and need, and you can communicate with that Dionysian spirit, and it will tell you what would keep you satisfied, or not just satisfied. How about thrilled out of your mind? That would even be better. And then you can admit that to yourself. In any case, you can reveal what your desires are to yourself. And that's a frightening thing, because what sort of lust-ridden, god-awful monster are you? And the answer to that might be exactly the sort of lust-ridden, god-awful monster that your partner would actually like to make love with. That's a possibility. And then you could say, well, I've got this fantasy, and it looks like something that would be deeply satisfying if it could make itself manifest. And it doesn't seem too perverse and short-term hedonic or destructive. And so I could admit that to myself, and then I could talk to my partner about it. And one of the things that's very interesting about short-term relationships is that people will do things with each other physically that they're too embarrassed to talk about. And they won't discuss it. And I would say, well, that's an indication that you put the cart before the horse, man. If you can't talk about it before you do it, then the level of intimacy that you have with your partner is not proportionate to the level of intimacy that you're pursuing physically, and that's a disjuncture and a disharmony, and it's suboptimal at the least, and it's really wrong. But with your marital partner, you can think, oh man, I'm stuck with you. Okay, so what are we gonna do about that? Well, how about we investigate the nature of each other's fantasies and see if we could deliver what's requested. And let's see if we could make that into a game. And I have some practical advice for that. It's like, okay, I was a therapist for a long time, and I talked to a lot of people about their marriages. I've been married 33 years as of 2 days ago, and it's gone pretty damn well. And sometimes it's gone so well I can hardly believe that I'm privileged enough to be alive and have it happen. And so, what do you need in a marriage to keep the romantic and intimate part alive? Well, first of all, you have to decide that you're going to do that. And you bloody well better decide that it's going to be a priority, because one of the things that will happen is that, well, you'll get cynical and you think, well, I don't have to date my wife or my husband, because that's what you do before you get married. Now that we're married, we can just take each other for granted. It's like, take your partner for granted for 15 years, and the wife is now a dowdy maid, and the husband is a balding, overweight, miserable wretch tied to his job. It's like, that's a bad outcome. And so it's hard to avoid, because once you're married and you have responsibilities and you have children, then the possibility of sexual adventure starts to fall down the hierarchy of import, and then you drift apart, and then you start fantasizing about other partners, and then maybe you have affair, and even if you don't, you're miserable and you want to be old because, you know, the vitality of your sexual youth is destroyed. Bad idea. So what do you do instead? Well, you have to talk to your wife, and this is very annoying. You have to talk to your wife at least 90 minutes a week about how the domestic economy is progressing. Just the details. Is the house in order? What rooms need to be fixed? What needs to be cleaned up? What jobs need to be done? How the kids are doing? What practical things have to be taken care of? Who's going to take care of it? In what order? How is that going to be done happily through joint negotiation? You need to have a board meeting once a week for 90 minutes. And if you think, well, I don't have time for that, it's like, fine, try not doing it. And then in 10 years, you'll be divorced. And then that will take half your money because you'll pay the lawyers. And it will take half your time for like 10 years. And it'll be like having cancer. So maybe you don't have time, and maybe you do. And so 90 minutes, you need that. You got to talk through the details of your life. And you probably have to clear most of that up before you can have an adventure on the intimacy front. And then you might say, well, how often should that occur? And we'll say, well, you're an adult and, you know, you've got other demands on your time. And so maybe once a week if you're really pushed, and maybe 3 times a week if you're really fortunate, and maybe you can settle on or aspire to twice. So you have 2 dates, and how long should they last? Well, how about 4 hours? And how much time should you put into it? Well, how about at least as much time as you would put in to having a date with someone that you were thrilled to have a date with if you were pursuing? And you think, well, I can't do that with my wife. It's like, well, try a little harder. Like, actually try. And the wife thinks, well, I'm not in the mood. It's like, get in the mood. Get in the mood. This isn't optional if you want to have a sustainable sex life across, an intimate life across the span of your life. It's like, you got to put some effort into it. This isn't nothing. And to attain that mystical union that can characterize sex at its best, you're going to bloody well become an expert at it. You're going to have to put in some effort. This isn't something that you just fall into like you fall into a pit. This is expert work, and you can get better and better and better at it. And so you got to put aside 3 to 4 hours, let's say. And what do you do? Well, what do people do when they have a date? Have dinner. Go out to a restaurant if you want, or have dinner at home and figure out who's going to cook and who's going to serve and try to make it pleasant. And then, well, what else can you do? Dance. Learn to dance. I don't dance. It's like, that's a hell of a thing to say, man. Because every social interaction is a dance. And you're not going to dance with your wife. Do you know what? That's foreplay. It's like, I don't engage in foreplay. It's like, well, why not? Well, obviously, because you're no bloody good at it. Obviously, that's why. Because if you were good at it, believe me, you'd be engaging in it. And so you can dance. And I saw this great video of my father-in-law dancing. He's 90. And he's barely standing up now, you know. And one of his caretakers, good woman who's in his house with him, with his current wife, got him up to dance. And you know, he's 90 and he could dance. It's like, hooray. And so maybe you could dance for the rest of your life with a woman that you love in your peaceful walled garden. If you had any sense and you weren't like hemming yourself in with these conceptions of who you can't be. I can't dance. I don't need to date my wife. You know, I'm saying this with some degree of shame too, because when my wife originally proposed, when we had small kids, that we have a date once a week or twice a week, you know, I was cynical about it right off the bat, and that was so stupid, man. I almost missed a major league opportunity there, because I thought the typical, you know, cliched rants of idiocy. I thought, well, you know, we're married, we don't need that, it's foolish, or it's beneath me, or it'll take all the spontaneity out of it. So that's what I wanted, I wanted perfect, spontaneous sex. That's what I was going for, like right off the bat. I didn't think were there any, like, you know, incremental steps towards that. It's like, it's not perfect, spontaneous sex, I'll have none of it. It's like, Woody Allen was smarter than that. He said, sex is good even when it's terrible, it's good. It's like, so, you know, don't wait around for perfection. And so I did overcome that pretty quickly, and we started practicing having dates, usually twice a week, and usually for 3 or 4 hours. And that's definitely been like a highlight of our mutual existence. And both Tammy and I got extremely ill over the last 3 years. We both just about died, and not just a little bit, many, many times for many months. and years. Awful. And we were separated a lot for 2 years, and it was hard for us to come back together because a lot of water had gone under the bridge and we were alienated from one another because we hadn't been around and because things had got so utterly, insanely complicated. And we started having dates again. We knew how to do it because we'd been practicing for 30 years. And even though I was still mostly dead and she was just recovering from a near fatal illness, we could do it. And it was good. And it provided the foundation for us to put our relationship back together. And it's better now than it ever has been on every front, as far as I can tell. And a huge part of that is this continual practice. And so we go for dinner, or we make dinner, or just alone, and then we dance. And I set up the upstairs room so it's beautiful. There's candles and music. And I spent hours putting together a musical playlist that's very beautiful. We usually use 30s and 40s jazz and crooners, not the hyper sentimental stuff, but there's some great positive romantic music from that era, maybe from the 20s to the 60s if you extend it. I've got about a 27-hour playlist that I've probably put 400 hours of work into. We have a beautiful room, and it's great. It's great. And it's a highlight, continual highlight of the week. And I shouldn't tell you all this because it's personal, but I'm going to anyways. So about 25 years ago, 30 years ago, I was checking out my fantasy life. And like most men, I'm fairly interested in visual displays of feminine beauty. And lingerie is it's a biological super stimulus. So it provokes visual sexual response in men, and different outfits add novelty, and novelty is an important aphrodisiac. And so I was looking at Victoria's Secret, I think, and thinking about lingerie, and I thought I could buy Tammy a whole bunch of lingerie. And so then I found this company called Trashy.com, which I think is quite funny, and they have all sorts of stockings and bodysuits and like very, very reasonably priced. So I bought like a truckload of it, which I thought was very funny. Really, like 100 pieces. I thought, well, what the hell? Maybe she'll wear it. And so I bought it, and she wore it. And so I would highly recommend that. It was definitely a wise investment of time and effort. And that's another way, when you have the same partner, you have to call out the mystery of novelty. And if you see the other person deeply, you can see them transform and change. And they're by no means dull or, what would you say, or casually set aside. Like I said, if you're bored by your partner, you might look to your own devices for the explanation of that. And you can continually revive that mystery. And one of the things I found with these dates, it's so interesting, is that if we set it up right, then there's a time shift that occurs. And the time shift is that we both get placed back in that time of our life when we fell deeply in love. And that happens over and over and over. And every time it happens, if we're doing this properly, it actually gets better. And it really is a kind of miracle. It's really something. And I also think it's rejuvenating, because in the rediscovery of that love and the rediscovery of what you remember about the person, because you remember the person you fell in love with, it's like you get rid of all the workaday concerns that obscure the intimacy. And then you remember who it is that you have with you. And you remember how thrilled you were to begin with if you were fortunate that this person was with you. And then you can have all that again. And you can practice having that. And why wouldn't you practice having that? Because maybe if you practiced it a lot and got really good at it, you could have it all the time. Because you get better at things when you practice them. And so 90 minutes a week, you talk business, and you sort out your life, and you negotiate. And twice a week for 3 hours, say, or 4 hours, you set aside an evening, and you don't have your phone, and you don't answer the door, and you don't talk about the practicalities of life. You just try to play with each other and learn how to play. And a lot of that can be done with dancing. And the idea that you can't dance, it's like, that's no excuse, just like not being in the mood. It's like, nope, Wrong, not a good idea, fix it. And if you have to learn to dance awkwardly, well, get better at it. You will if you practice.